You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
Welcome everyone to Military Knowledge. On May 9, 19... After one of the fiercest battles in human history, the Soviet Red Army captured Berlin, the heart of the Nazi German Empire, ending World War II on European soil. However, the path to ultimate victory was the most brutal, built upon the blood and bones of millions of Soviet and Allied soldiers, and the courage and strategic brilliance of outstanding Soviet generals. Join us as we delve into the final blow once and for all that the Soviet Red Army delivered to Nazi Germany in the Berlin campaign of 1945. By the spring on, the strategic initiative had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. On the Eastern Front, a series of fierce attacks during the previous winter had broken the German encirclement of Leningrad in the north. In the south, the Soviet Red Army had swept away Axis forces across much of Ukraine, now that the summer offensive was underway. Stalin and the Soviet Red Army headquarters turned their attention to Belarus, where the German Army Group Center was concentrated in a large area jutting out north of the Pripyat River, encompassing the Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev-Bobruisk regions. In his usual arrogant manner, Hitler declared those cities to be fortresses. The balcony of Belarus. Hitler believed that the front lines of the Third Reich's Army Group Center would not be breached by the summer of 1944, so he made the mistake of moving most of the armored divisions on the eastern front downstream of the Pripyat River, where he believed that if the Soviet army intended to attack, that would be the direction they would aim. Bagration was the codename for the Soviet Army's strategic offensive in the summer of 19... officially beginning from June 23 to August 29, 1940. Deception tactics always played a crucial role in the Red Army's success in both counter-offensive and offensive campaigns from the winter of 1942 to the spring of 1944. However, throughout the preceding period of the war, no deception operation had been as meticulously prepared as the Belorussia campaign, because the success of the campaign depended heavily on the secret concentration of reserves and the repositioning of army groups between fronts. The primary objective of the deception operations was to conceal these troop movements, and then to convince Hitler and the high command of the Nazi German army that the Red Army's next target would be Central and Southern Eastern Europe. No. The main meeting to plan Operation Bagration took place in Moscow on May 20, 19, with the presence of leader Stalin and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the First Belarusian Front. The two initially disagreed deeply. Stalin wanted to launch a direct attack on Bobruisk from Rogachow, while Rokossovsky, understanding better than anyone that the German Ninth Army had anticipated, wanted to open another line of attack from the south via Perichi. The meeting was tense. Stalin lost his temper several times but restrained himself, twice dismissing Rokossovsky from the room to reconsider his decision. Both times Rokossovsky stubbornly returned and insisted that he believed 2 attacks were better than 1. Ultimately, Stalin approved Rokossovsky's plan. Ladies and gentlemen, this story is completely true, not just an anecdote. Who was arrested and interrogated during Stalin's purge of the army in 1938 demonstrated a strong, decisive personality and a willingness to prioritize the greater good over old grudges and animosities. On the other hand, the story also demonstrates Stalin's open-mindedness towards the generals under his command who had served him very well since 1942. From the end of May 1940, the Soviet Red Army shifted its entire front to a defensive posture. Every measure to maintain secrecy was implemented. High-powered radio transmission stations ceased operation. The attack plan was only shared with a very small number of people involved. The troop movements were only carried out at night. The troop concentration points were heavily camouflaged. The soldiers holding the line were not informed of the arrival of the new unit. The newly deployed Air Force units are not permitted to conduct reconnaissance flights. The fighter units on the ground established a tight air patrol perimeter to prevent any enemy reconnaissance aircraft from approaching. Unlike the deceptive tactics of previous campaigns, this time the Red Army employed a real but deceptive strategy by leaving 4-5-6 of its tank army group in the Ukrainian region, while using one of these army groups to launch an early offensive toward Romania in early May 1944. The expansion of fortifications was carried out simultaneously with the laying of dummy minefields, giving the impression that the Soviet army groups only wanted to defend their position. They pretended to move tanks, artillery, and soldiers during the day, but reassembled them at night, constructing fake roads and intersections. Concentrate artillery in secondary locations, where numerous obstacles are placed. Then withdraw, leaving only dummy artillery pieces in the firing positions. Deploy large numbers of tanks and dummy self-propelled artillery on secondary fronts. And the officers had to check daily the implementation of the deception plan. In addition, the fronts in this area were ordered to organize more ghost troops to conceal the fact that 2 tank armies had been transferred. Radio stations were also ordered to simulate troop concentrations along with busy train movements in the area. The air patrol perimeter was occasionally left open, intentionally allowing enemy reconnaissance aircraft to penetrate, while inspecting a swampy area on the front line. Gen. Batov, commander of the 65th Army Group of the 1st Belarusian Front, noticed some of the scouts wearing swamp-crossing boots woven from reeds. These swamp boots reduced the pressure on each step of the soldiers. As they walked, the mud beneath their feet solidified, preventing them from sinking, while water seeped through the gaps in the outer weave and drained away as they continued to step. General Batov thought for a moment and then decided to focus his main attack here, where the Germans least expected it, to allow tanks and heavy equipment to move across the swamp. General Batov ordered a road to be built using wooden planks. The logs used for planks were cut and sawn 15-20 km away from the front line so that the German troops could not hear the sound of the trees falling and the sawing, and then fastened together with iron braces. From there, plank roads were quickly laid immediately after the leading infantry units crossed the swamp to establish bridgeheads on the other side. Also on a historic meeting took place between the 5th Guards Army of the Ukrainian Front under Marshal Konev, which rapidly advancing westward, and the U.S. 1st Army at the town of Torgau on the Elbe River. The Red Army High Command had previously outlined the crucial task of advancing to this river and linking up with any Allied force to disrupt the plans of the Nazi German leadership, who were seeking to prolong the war and sign separate peace treaties with Britain or the United States. American veterans later recalled that the reunion with the Red Army soldiers on the Elbe River was very warm, truly reflecting the spirit of soldiers who had fought on the same front line. The Soviet soldiers poured the American soldiers glasses of the famous Russian vodka, while the Americans generously treated their brothers to canned meat. Before Berlin was completely surrounded, the Soviet Red Army began the phase of eliminating the last pockets of Nazi resistance in every corner of the inner city. But not easily subdued overnight, the German army resisted fiercely to the very end. The two sides fought fiercely, vying for control of every neighborhood and every house. Here, the German Panzerfaust shoulder-fired recoilless anti-tank weapon was widely distributed to many German citizens and paramilitary forces, and its effectiveness could not be underestimated. In the street battles of Berlin alone, nearly 2,000 Soviet other armored vehicles were destroyed. To break down the German resistance strongholds in the housing, the Red Army had to split its tank and artillery units into smaller units, with infantry units chosen as the shock troops to support the artillery and tank units firing directly at the windows. In this battle, the Red Army once again demonstrated far superior experience compared to their opponent. They destroyed the ammunition depots first, then divided the resistance areas into smaller sections, concentrating firepower to isolate and completely eliminate each area. Although the German army resisted fiercely, to the very end, when they ran out of ammunition, they had no choice but to commit suicide or surrender. Furthermore, the German troops entrenched in the streets lacked heavy weaponry and were therefore unable to compete with the Red Army's tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Also unable to, the German propaganda department intercepted a BBC report from London stating, Chief Spy Himmler secretly negotiated to offer the German army in the West the surrender to the American forces. For Hitler doubted Himmler's absolute loyalty. This was the most painful blow. SS units and Volkssturm militia forces were gradually being pushed out of the buildings. All remaining German armed forces, primarily the most loyal SS units, were heavily concentrated in the area around the German parliament and the Imperial Office, where Hitler's bunker was located. The final battle to capture the German parliament building began around noon on April 29th, supported by artillery and airstrikes. The Red Army infantry units charged into close combat, fighting with the conviction of annihilating Nazi Germany. The fighting was extremely fierce and relentless, with both sides fighting for every room, every stairwell, and every floor. By the afternoon of April 30th, a Red Army assault team had finally entered the building, and at 9:50 p.m., 2 Soviet reconnaissance soldiers from the 756th, 150th Infantry Division, 3rd Shock, 1st Belarusian Front, Sergeant Mikhail Alexeyevich Egorov's Russian and Corporal Melitin Valamovich Kantaria Georgian, representing the victorious Soviet peoples, planted the red flag with the hammer and sickle and gold star, the Soviet national flag, on the dome of the parliament building of an empire that had caused World War II. In the early days of his retreat to the underground bunker at the Imperial, Adolf Hitler still boldly declared to the world that the empire he had built would reign for one. However, by the time the Soviet flag flew atop the German parliament building, the Nazi empire created by Hitler had lasted only 12 years. The photograph of Hitler stepping out of his bunker with a bodyguard to observe the devastated surroundings after Allied and Soviet air raids just before his suicide is believed to be the last photograph of the Nazi leader. Before his death, Adolf then managed to quickly marry his long-time girlfriend Eva Braun, 30. After the wedding, Hitler began preparing his final will and drafting a political manifesto with his secretary, Trod Junge. He wrote, "My wife and I chose death to avoid the humiliation of surrender or being overthrown. Our wish is to be cremated immediately at the place where I worked every day for 12 years. On the same day, Hitler learned that his fascist Italian ally, Benito Mussolini, had been executed and his body hung in the street. Sitting side by side on a sofa in the basement living room, Eva Braun committed suicide by drinking cyanide, while Hitler allegedly shot himself in the head. It was April 30, 1905, 10 days after Hitler's 56th birthday. 12 years and 3 months after he became Chancellor of Germany and established the Third Reich. So this empire only lasted a week longer than him. Just before the Red Army stormed the Imperial Office, Nazi Germany's Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, and his wife injected their 6 young children with poison before committing suicide. In his will, Hitler bequeathed the presidency of the empire to Admiral Karl Donitz and the chancellorship to Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels. General Hans Krebs, who had served as Germany's military attaché in Moscow before the war, was sent to meet with Red Army leaders to propose negotiations. Red Army Commander Georgy Zhukov gave the German side more than an hour to decide whether to surrender unconditionally. On the evening of May 1, 1940, after learning that the German government refused to surrender, the Red Army launched a massive artillery barrage. The commander of Berlin's defenses, German Artillery Lieutenant General Helmuth Weidling, had ordered the raising of the white flag. However, scattered desperate shots from the last pockets of SS resistance still echoed throughout the city, but Berlin was considered to have completely fallen. On May 7, 19, in Reims of France, General Alfred Jold, Chief of Staff of the German Operational Command, on behalf of the Imperial Government of Admiral Karl Donitz, signed the surrender document to the Allied forces and the Soviet Red Army, before representatives of the British, French, and American armies. The Soviet Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Joseph Stalin, strongly opposed such a surrender procedure. He demanded that the official surrender ceremony take place in Berlin, with the highest representatives of the German armed forces and presided over by representatives of the Red Army. In order to be worthy of the Soviet Union's contribution to the common cause of defeating fascism, the Allied leaders agreed to consider the signing of the surrender on May 7th as a preliminary declaration of surrender and would hold a formal surrender ceremony for Germany in Berlin. The following day, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces, along with representatives from the Navy, Army, and other German armed forces, were brought to Berlin on the night of May 8th, before representatives of the Allied forces. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, on behalf of the Soviet Union, presided over the ceremony of signing and accepting the official surrender of Nazi Germany. When the Allied forces entered Germany, the concentration camps horrified even the most hardened soldiers. With hundreds of thousands of prisoners who were no different from walking corpses, and millions of disfigured bodies. Even decades later, many people still feel intense anger when they recall those frail, staggering walking skeletons. The only thing the fascist state had left for them to cling to in their will to survive. Graves, cellars, and mass burial pits. Rows of crematoriums were filled with charred skeletons. This is clear evidence of a large-scale massacre of political prisoners. According to our research, in order to crush the last stronghold of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Red Army suffered heavy losses, with 78 killed and 174 others wounded. The German side lost approximately 100,000 soldiers were wounded. The war ended with approximately 5,000 of Berlin's 2 million civilians killed in the fighting. Even though more than 7 decades have passed with countless ups and downs and historical events, the Great War that defeated fascism is still honored by peace-loving people around the world, because it was the solid foundation that built the prosperous and sustainable world we see today. Thank you for watching the entire video. Hello and see you in the next videos.